All right, now, again, I'm gonna go over all my fluids first, okay? I wanna go ahead and check all my fluids. So I'm gonna make sure that my power steering fluid, I wanna make sure that it's at the proper operating level, which it is. None of it's leaking, none of the hoses have any abrasion bumps or cuts. Everything's tight, okay? My coolant level, I wanna make sure that the reservoir is not cracked, damaged, loose, or leaking. None of the hoses have any abrasion bumps or cuts. I wanna make sure it's at proper operating level and proper color. And again, I'm gonna make sure that that's tight. I don't see any leaks on any of my hoses from my power steering reservoir. Okay, now I'm going to go to my power steering pump here. These are some of the main components. Okay, my power steering pump, I see it down in here. I'm going to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, loose, or leaking. It is gear driven, so you do not have to check a belt on it, but you want to make sure it's not leaking. And you want to check all your hoses. Make sure your hoses don't have any abrasion bumps or cuts on them. Okay, now right behind that, okay, it's real hard to see from here, but right behind that is my air compressor. Okay, I want to make sure that my air compressor is not cracked, damaged, loose, or leaking. It is also gear driven. And you want to peek up in there and look at all your hoses and make sure that none of your hoses have any abrasion bumps or cuts on them. My power steering gearbox seems to be properly mounted. All my bolts are tight. Nothing's cracked, damaged, or loose. Again, all my hoses don't have any abrasion bumps or cuts on them. Okay, so now we're going to go back again to our 3 pieces. There's actually 4 pieces on this side we need to worry about. We have brakes, we have suspension, we have wheels, and we have steering. Okay. So let's go ahead and knock our steering out, okay? My steer shaft, you want to make sure that it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. You want to make sure it's not bent in any way. You want to check your U-joints. You want to make sure your U-joints are not cracked, damaged, or loose. And you want to make sure that they're properly greased, both U-joints here, okay? Both of them in good condition. All right, now I'm going to check my pitman arm. Okay, this is my pitman arm. I want to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. It's not bent in any way that's not specified by the manufacturer, okay? It is secured with a castle nut and cotter pin. Okay, and they are tight. My drag link, I want to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, loose, or bent. Okay, and it's secure with a castle nut and cotter pin. Okay, and my steering knuckle, I want to make sure that it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. Okay, and it's secure. All right. Now, right behind this right here is my tie rod. Okay, I want to make sure that my tie rod is not cracked, damaged, or loose, and make sure it's not bent, and make sure it's secure with a castle nut and cotter pin, which it is. All right. So that covers my steering. Now let's go ahead and knock out my suspension. Okay, I've got my leaf spring hanger here. Make sure it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. I got my shackle in the back. I want to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. And remember, signs of looseness are going to be shiny metal and metal shavings. I want to make sure my leaf springs are not cracked, damaged, or loose. I want to make sure that my bump stop isn't cracked, damaged, or loose. I want to make sure my U-bolts aren't cracked, damaged, or loose. Upper and lower shock mount in my shock, good condition. They're not cracked, damaged, or loose. Signs of leaking on my shock will be hydraulic fluid. Okay, you want to make sure that there's no hydraulic fluid there indicating a bad shock. Okay, so that covers my suspension, that covers my steering. Let's go ahead and talk about my brakes. All right, my brake hose and ABS wire, you want to make sure none of that has any abrasion bumps or cuts on it. Again, you want to make sure that your ABS wire is not in a position where it could be frayed. Okay, everything seems to be secure there. My brake chamber, it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. Okay, all the nuts and bolts are tight and my clamp is tight. Okay, I don't hear any leaks coming from the brake chamber. My push rod isn't cracked, damaged, or loose. Okay, right here. My slack adjuster isn't cracked, damaged, or loose. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and tug on that and make sure we don't have any more than 1 inch of play. Okay, which we don't. Everything's working good there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and finish my brakes out. Okay, now I'm going to look at my pads down in here. Okay, I'm going to make sure that I have at least 1/4 inch of pad. Okay, that's the minimum. You want to make sure they're not cracked, damaged, or loose, and you want to make sure that there's no oil or grease on them. My drum, it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. There's no oil or grease, and you also want to make sure it shows no sign of any excessive heat. Okay. Now we're going to work our way out to our wheel here. Okay, both sides of my rim, you want to make sure they're not cracked, damaged, or loose. You want to make sure there's no illegal welds on them, no oil or grease. Okay. My lug nuts, you make sure they're all tight. Okay, signs of looseness there will be rust streaks, shiny metal, or metal shavings. Okay, again, my steer axle hub right here, you want to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, loose, or leaking. You want to make sure it's a proper operating level. Okay, indicated by the sight glass. My valve stem, you want to make sure it's not cracked, damaged, or loose. Okay, it's not leaking. All right, 100 psi in these tires, and you want to check that with an air gauge. Okay, now let's go ahead and inspect our tire. Sidewalls, both sidewalls. You want to make sure have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts, properly seated. Okay, top of my tire. Cannot be recaps, cannot be regrooves, must match the other side. Okay, 4/32 tread depth, no uneven wear. okay, and no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. All right, these tires are in good shape.